this tutorial, we're going to take a look at some criteria you can use to determine whether sources, that is articles on research studies, for your psychology research product are reliable and relevant. My name is Jane Germer, and I'm the librarian here at Doane, responsible for the psychology department. Anytime you have questions about your psychology research, you can reach me either by email or phone, or just drop by the library. You can even set up an appointment for a longer research consultation of 15 minutes or more. Now that you know who I am, let's get started. The 5 criteria I'm going to talk about in this tutorial are aspects of a source's research question, the authority of the source's authors or creators that give credence to the information presented, what you should look for to determine the accuracy of information, questions about the source's methodology as a good fit for the study, and then how you might discover any bias in the source. So, how can the research question of a study be evaluated? First, try to find the study's research question, hypothesis, or objective. You may be able to find it in the abstract, or you may have to read further into the article to find it. It might be in the introduction, or maybe in the section above the methodology. Second, do the authors tell you why this study was important enough to undertake? For what purpose did they do this study? And third, do the authors describe the group or population they are studying? Do they mention what treatment or therapy or type of intervention they used or studied? Essentially, the research question should give you a pretty good idea of who, what, and why the study was done. Here's an example of an article that describes the purpose of the study in the introduction section, and then the research question is stated as a primary and secondary aim of the study, with the population studied, children and adolescents and adult women, and the what, which is the disorder trichotillomania or hair pulling. No treatment or therapy is part of this study. The authors are only studying those with the disorder and how it plays out over one's lifetime. Now let's look at the criterion authority. Once you've identified the authors or creators, how do you determine whether they have expertise in the subject of the study? One clue is the institution and department listed for the authors within the article itself. Usually this information is listed on the first page of the article, but it also might be found on the last page of the article. If the article is online, you might need to click on or hover over the authors' names to see their affiliations. You might also do a quick internet search to see where they currently work, their job title, and maybe other publications that they have authored. You should also pay attention to any disclaimers or conflict of interest statements at the end of an article. Most researchers who work at colleges and universities depend on outside funding for their research, and that can come from a government agency such as the National Science Foundation, or it might come from a charitable or research organization like the American Lung Association. Do a search for the funding agency to see what their purpose is for existing. Also, if you see a study that is funded by an organization like a pharmaceutical company and it's one of their own drugs being studied, how much credence can you give that? Knowing if a research journal is peer-reviewed can also be a clue. If you find a study in a database, look at the record for the journal publication. That may tell you if it's peer-reviewed. But if you find an article in Google Scholar, you might need to look at the journal's website or do a Wikipedia search for the journal. On their website, you can look in the About or Journal Information page to find out if they are peer-reviewed. Here's an example of the author's affiliations mentioned at the bottom of an article's first page. You'll notice that either they work in the field of psychology or medicine. And this acknowledgement at the end of the article tells us that this Trichotillomania Learning Center funded this study. It would be a good idea to do a quick search on the TLC to find out more about it. Another aspect we look at to evaluate a source is accuracy. Of course, you want to be able to trust the information in your source because your research's accuracy depends on theirs. Some questions you might want to ask about the source is just what information is the author citing or referring to? And can you find that same information in another source. Read through the references at the end of the article to look for their recency, if it's important, as well as the journals and books they're published in. If the journal titles are abbreviated, it's pretty easy to find out their full title with a quick Google search. Are there any authors mentioned repeatedly in the references? They might be an important original author, researchers on this topic, and worth taking a look at their work included. It's especially important if the information is not well known or common knowledge to verify that it's accurately reported in your source. Also, as you read through a source, are there studies or findings mentioned that aren't cited? Can you do a Google or Google Scholar search to find these uncited sources? Finally, read the conclusions and/or results carefully to see if they actually can be confidently made based on the data and analysis, and that they actually reflect on the original research question. A look at this list of references, it's easy to see that they are not listed in alphabetical order, but instead in the order they appear in the article. The journal titles are abbreviated, so you might try to find out what their full titles are. You also may notice that these references aren't very new, but then again, the article itself may be older. Should I do another search to see if there's any more current studies on my topic? When you're researching a topic in a field like psychology, the methods used in a research study is very important to the validity and accuracy of the article. For example, if a research question dealt with the efficacy of behavioral therapy, would recording blood pressure every 6 hours for 2 weeks be an appropriate study? It would be appropriate if blood pressure is the only measure that you're studying, but otherwise it would not. In addition, the number of participants will impact the ability to generalize the study's outcome to a larger population. If the study only reports on 12 participants and they aren't from different demographics, it's unlikely that you can take these outcomes and apply them to the general public or even just for those who have the same condition. The methods or methodology section of a research article should give you information about the participants, the number, their demographics, and so on, and how they were recruited for the study. In this example, the authors note the participants were recruited through the Trichotillomania Learning Center and had 3 factors in common. They were 10 years old or older, were female, and met the criteria for trichotillomania or TTM. It also mentions that data was collected as part of 2 larger studies about TTM, one for children and one for adults. The methods section continues with discussion of the 2 largest studies and which provided better measures for the children. The summary section of this article has the total number of the participants mentioned and an analysis of the limits on the study's generalizability. The final criterion for evaluating your sources is bias. Bias isn't always easy to spot, so you need to read critically to determine if there is bias in a study. Look at the population studied. Are there demographics described? Is there anyone missing? For example, does a study that recruits people through an internet site bias against those who don't use or have access to the internet? Also, could there be any bias against those is there any bias in the methodology used? If a survey is done by cell phone, are those who don't have a cell being left out of the study? Or maybe the survey is only distributed in one language and could exclude those who don't read that language. Another question to consider is whether the population who the researchers were able to recruit for the study caused the inclusion or exclusion criteria to change because not enough people could be found with that criteria. And did those changes impact the results of the study? Surely, if the population studied is significantly different from that for which the study was designed, there will be an impact on the outcomes, especially if any criteria are demographically based. In this example of a study's participants, you can see that the exclusion of males is rationalized. In addition to giving demographic information on the women in the study by ethnicity, household income, marital status, and a diagnosis of TTM and other mental health issues. So let's take a look at a research article and apply the criteria for evaluation. The research question, authority, accuracy, methodology, and bias. If I was researching the use of drugs in the treatment of trichotillomania or TTM, this article might be of interest. Notice at the top, it tells me this article is original research. Scanning the abstract, I can find the study's objective, number of participants, the treatment or method, and the conclusions in the outcome of the study. But this summary doesn't provide everything. I'll have to scan a little further. At the bottom of the page, I find a little information about the authors, where they were working at the time of the publication, and what department. Since they all work in the area of psychiatry, I might assume they are experts on the topic of pharmaceuticals as a treatment for a mental health issue. I'll also notice near the bottom of the page the reason why they undertook this study, because there wasn't pharmacological treatment for TTM at the time of publication. On to the next page of the article. I find a review of the current state of treating TTM along with some citations of these sources. And for example, I see at the top that cognitive behavioral therapy is a common treatment, and there are 3 sources cited for this fact, which I can then check out by finding those articles. At the end of the introduction of the literature or the literature review, I find the research question and hypothesis that the drug dronabinol will reduce compulsive hair pulling, and they will also investigate any neurocognitive effects of the drug. In the next section, labeled Methods, I see an expanded description of the participants, how they were recruited, what criteria they had to meet, and what criteria were used to exclude participants. On the next page of the article, the number of participants is mentioned, describing they were all female and their mean age. The next subsection describes the study's design and then what assessments were used, such as subjects were assessed every 3 weeks for 12 weeks and what tool was used for the primary outcome of reducing hair pulling compulsion. On page 4 of this article is the tool used for the secondary measure, plus the description of the tools for the cognitive assessments and what measures were used to assure the safety of the participants. The next subsections is the data analysis and criteria set for inclusion in the analysis, which all 14 participants met. The results section is found here on the following page, discussing the participants' demographics, which are laid out in the chart at the bottom of the page, as well as the efficacy results of the drug being tested. Those results are also displayed in the chart on the next page, as well as a discussion section that summarizes what the study was about and its outcomes. These outcomes are presented in the tables on the next page, as well as a discussion section that are presented on the next page, as well as in the text. On the last page of the article, the limitations of the study are discussed, including possible areas that there might be bias that may have affected the results, and a statement that it may not generalize to the larger population. At the end of the article are 2 statements. One tells the reader how it was funded internally by the University of Minnesota School of Medicine, and the other describes any conflicts of interest the authors may have. Finally, we want to look at the references list. A few things I notice on this first page are that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders used is an older edition. Now, it's probably that this was the most current when this article was published in 2011. But I would probably want to check the most current version of the DSM to make sure that there hadn't been any changes on the information about trichotillomania. Second, as I scan the note citations, I notice that there are 3 here that have the same first author, G.A. Christensen. So I might want to find out more about this author and see if they have done any more recent studies on TTM. Third, I look at the dates of the citations. And here's one that's dated 1960. So it's pretty old, but it may be a standard citation for rating depression. So that's probably okay if it's that old. Overall, I think this article may be very helpful for research on pharmacological treatment of trichotillomania, though I'll probably want to look for more current studies on this topic since this is over 10 years old. I hope this tutorial gives you some ideas of how to evaluate research articles for relevancy and validity. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me by phone, email, or just dropping by the library. You can also set up a longer appointment for a research session with the Calendly link. Now that you've watched this tutorial, complete the Evaluating Sources quiz in the box below. And if you have any questions or comments about the tutorial, use the link under the tab Q&A Evaluating Sources in the Discussions and Question box at the bottom of the page. I'll be monitoring this page and answer your questions throughout the semester. Remember, the library staff is here to help you succeed.